Chicago, 1893. The World's Fair was dazzling millions with electric lights and grand promises of the future. But just a few blocks away, in a building that seemed ordinary from the outside, something terrifying was happening. People checked into a hotel that seemed designed for comfort, but they never checked out. The walls were thick, the air heavy with a chemical smell, and strange chutes and trapdoors were built into the structure. The man behind it all was a charming doctor named H. Holmes, but his charm hid something much darker, a fascination with death and a twisted desire to play God. Herman Webster Mudgett was born in 1861, but the world would come to know him by a different name, H. Holmes. As a child, he was bullied and forced to touch a human skeleton by his tormentors. But what should have been a moment of terror became something else. Instead of fear, he felt curiosity and power. He carried that fascination into adulthood, studying medicine and learning how to manipulate both bodies and people. During medical school, he even stole corpses, disfigured them, and used the bodies to scam insurance companies. This was just the beginning of his obsession with murder and deception. Eventually, Herman Mudgett became Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, a name that sounded respectable and trustworthy. And in the rapidly growing city of Chicago, a place filled with people chasing new dreams, Holmes saw an opportunity to build his twisted empire. Holmes didn't just build a hotel. He built a death trap. The building, known as the World's Fair Hotel, was constructed with bizarre, dangerous features designed to confuse and trap his victims. There were staircases that led to nowhere, doors that opened to brick walls, and rooms that were completely soundproof. But it got even worse. Holmes installed gas pipes in some of the rooms, which allowed him to fill them with poisonous gas whenever he wanted. Secret chutes led to the basement, where Holmes disposed of bodies by stripping their flesh and selling the skeletons to medical schools. Many of his victims were young women who came to Chicago looking for work. Holmes charmed them with job offers or romantic attention, only to lure them into his castle of horrors. One of his most famous victims was Julia Smythe. Julia was the wife of Ned Connor, who worked at Holmes' pharmacy in his murder castle. She started an affair with Holmes, leading to her husband leaving her and their daughter, Pearl. Holmes promised to marry Julia if she gave him custody of Pearl. On Christmas Eve of 1891, Holmes lured Julia to a secret room under the pretense of performing an abortion. Instead, he killed her using chloroform, and it's believed he later sold her skeleton to a medical school. Emeline Cigrand. Emeline was a young, beautiful woman who worked as Holmes' secretary in 1892. Holmes charmed her with his wealth and good looks, promising her marriage. He persuaded her to stay at his hotel, where he eventually locked her in a vault designed to be soundproof and airtight. Emeline's death was slow and terrifying, as she suffocated while Holmes listened from outside. Afterward, he disposed of her body, likely selling her skeleton to a medical institution. Benjamin Pitezel. Pitezel was one of Holmes' accomplices, helping him with insurance scams. In 1894, Holmes convinced Pitezel to fake his own death to collect a $10,000 insurance payout. Instead of faking Pitezel's death, Holmes killed him by knocking him unconscious and setting him on fire while he was still alive. Holmes then manipulated Pitezel's wife and took custody of 3 of their children, whom he later murdered while traveling across different states. Holmes employed dozens of people to help build his castle, but only a few survived, and most of them never fully understood what kind of building they were helping to construct. The 1893 World's Fair brought millions of people to Chicago, and Holmes saw it as the perfect hunting ground. He preyed on tourists and those looking for work. His charming nature and convincing smile made people trust him, and that trust was their undoing. But greed eventually led to Holmes' downfall. In one of his most infamous schemes, he convinced his business associate, Benjamin Pitezel, to fake his death to collect a $10,000 insurance policy. But Holmes had other plans. Instead of faking Pitezel's death, Holmes actually murdered him and then manipulated Pitezel's wife into letting him travel with 3 of their children. Holmes promised Mrs. Pitezel that her children were safe, but one by one he killed them. The details are horrifying. He locked 2 of them, Alice and Nellie, in a trunk, drilled a hole, and filled the container with gas until they suffocated. Their bodies were later found buried in a shallow grave. Besides this killing spree, Holmes was married 3 times. He first married Clara Lovering in 1878, and they had a son named Robert Lovering Mudgett in 1880, who later became a certified public accountant. While still legally married to Clara, Holmes married Myrta Belknap in 1887, and they had a daughter named Lucy Theodate Holmes in 1889, who grew up to be a schoolteacher. His third marriage was to Georgiana Yoke in 1894, just months before his arrest. Despite his criminal activities, Holmes kept his family away from his dark deeds, and they lived relatively normal lives. Holmes might have continued his killing spree if it weren't for Detective Frank Geyer. Geyer was determined to find out what happened to the Pitezel children. His investigation led him through several cities, where he eventually uncovered their remains. The evidence was undeniable, and Holmes was finally arrested. During his trial, Holmes confessed to 27 murders, but many believe the real number was much higher. Some estimates put the total at over 200. Holmes seemed to enjoy the attention and even claimed to be a devil born into human form. On May 7, 1896, Holmes was executed by hanging, but his death was slow and agonizing. His neck didn't break as expected. Instead, he slowly strangled to death, his twisted smile still present, as if even his death was just another act. Even after his execution, Holmes left behind mysteries. The hotel, often called the Murder Castle, mysteriously burned down shortly after his arrest. Was it an accident, or was someone trying to hide the evidence of what happened there? Years later, construction workers uncovered human bones in the ruins. And even today, historians debate the true number of his victims. Holmes was a master manipulator, a con artist, and a serial killer who took advantage of people's trust and desperation. His story is a dark reminder that monsters can look just like everyone else. They can build hotels, shake your hand, and smile while planning your end. So, next time you walk into a hotel or trust someone who seems a little too charming, remember H. Holmes and ask yourself, how well do you really know the people around you? Because sometimes the devil doesn't hide. He builds the place where you're staying. Subscribe to The Murder Maze for more terrifying stories that reveal the darkest parts of human nature.